SaaS Backwards is sponsored by Austin Lawrence Group, specializing in demand gen for SaaS. It sure is noisy. I deleted 100 emails from vendors just this morning. Your buyer has gotten better at ignoring you, and you're gonna need a big idea if you want to cut through all that clutter. Austin Lawrence is just the right agency to help you find it. So if your campaigns are falling on deaf eyeballs, let's talk. Visit austinlawrence.com today and let's build something bigger.
Welcome to the SaaS Backwards podcast, where we reverse engineer the success of fast-growing SaaS firms and explore strategies CMOs and CEOs are using to drive their businesses forward.
Welcome to SaaS Backwards, a podcast that helps SaaS CMOs and CEOs to accelerate growth and enhance profitability. Our guest today is Michael Hoffman, founder and CEO of Gather Voices, a SaaS that is creating the category of video relationship management, technology that enables organizations to stay connected to their constituents with video. Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm really excited to record your episode. It's a great topic. And before we dig in, could you please just tell us a little bit more about yourself, your background, and your company?
Sure. So I took a long route to get to here, starting in law school and ended up dropping out of law school to start internet companies back in the earlier days of the internet. And I had that experience and then decided to bootstrap a company and built a communications and marketing firm called C3 Communications, based in Chicago, but working all over the world. And I grew that firm. And that's really what led me to what we're doing today at Gather Voices. I had a lot of clients coming to me at the agency and saying, we love those videos you make for us, those professional videos that take months to make and cost tens of thousands of dollars. But we need video for everything. We need video for social media. We need video for our website. We need video all the time. And the traditional production process of an agency just doesn't scale. It's too expensive. It's too slow. And our clients were looking for something else. And that's really what led me to start Gather Voices.
So basically, you just told me that my business is too expensive, we're too slow, and we don't scale. I think I'm going to go with it, though. I think you're right. I think that the hurdles of video production mean that we don't do enough of it. Our clients, unless they're fabulously successful, right? The client base can't do the video. So I totally hear you.
Yeah, and there's a lot more video than there was before out there. So I think there's still room for professional production, but you need 100 times more content than you did before because there's so many more channels, and there's channels that are really lean toward video. So you need to have a solution for that.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's a deluge of content, and we need to find a way to stand out, right? That's the real challenge. In marketing that's content dependent, we need to find a great way to stand out. Let's dig in a little bit deeper, though. When we were talking before the podcast, you had an aha moment that sort of helped you realize this. And I think, for would-be entrepreneurs or folks looking for their second or third go, so I think the aha moment is always an interesting kind of time to reflect on. Can you share that with us?
Sure. I think that it really starts, the aha moment is not just the moment, it's also that you're obsessed with or thinking about a problem. And then you have that aha moment that is, how are you going to deal with that problem? So for us, the problem was the lack of scalability of video. And the aha moment was learning about the first feature film that was shot on an iPhone. And so realizing in 1 second that everybody we wanted on video is walking around with essentially a professional video camera in their pocket. And so that begged the question of, why are we sending camera crews out all the time? And why are we making this so expensive when everyone we want on video is walking around with the kinds of tools that just weren't imaginable a few years before?
Yeah, I mean, it is amazing when you think about what you carry in your pocket and sort of harnessing that, right? So almost everybody can be a videographer. But I guess that the thing that struck me also was your perspective on what it takes to create impactful video. You'd mentioned to me that you felt authenticity was almost like the sole determinant of success.
Yeah, I think that's right. Several things had to come together for us to start Gather Voices and for it to make sense and for it to be as successful as it is. And one of those things was the technology that I mentioned. Without powerful webcams and powerful phones, that we don't actually use for calling so much anymore, but for everything else. Without that technology, we couldn't do it. But that's not the only factor. The other factor has been the kind of content that people are interested in. When I started the agency, really highly produced, highly polished video is what people wanted. And today, people have figured out how to tune that stuff out, really. And if we look at where people are spending their time and look at the rise of TikTok, for example, and YouTube Shorts and Instagram, it's what's driving the culture, what's getting attention are real people telling their real stories. It's not production values. And so the great story, the funny story, the interesting story will beat the highly produced thing every single time. And that's what we see in the culture. And so if that wasn't true, then user-generated content wouldn't be as powerful as it is today. And so, what we saw was that in the entertainment and consumer culture, you have all this video content of real people telling their stories. But when you go into the business world and you think about B2B, you still have people operating like, it's 2003. They're making the same videos that they were making before. They're doing once or twice a year things with this kind of content. And they're just, the gap between what we see on the consumer side and what we see on the business side is so huge. And I got kind of obsessed with the idea that here's this person in their bedroom with no budget and the device that they have anyway, and they're making content that thousands or millions of people are viewing and interested in. And then you have this company over here that has a marketing team and a budget, and they hire professionals, and they can't get a fraction of the engagement that this one person in their bedroom is getting. And so I was thinking, what's happening here? Why is one this way and the other that way? And that's still true today, really, across business, that the consumer side and the entertainment side has outpaced what businesses have been able to do. And we're just starting to see that crack. And that's really what we're doing at Gather Voices. We're saying, hey, there has to be a new paradigm for business to be able to play in this new sandbox. And that means thinking about video differently. It means creating video differently, producing video differently, thinking about your brand differently. And that's what we think of as video relationship management. That's what we think of as the tool set that we're bringing into the business world.
Well, I think that's a great war cry and, a vision that plenty of marketers could see themselves following, right? It's like, in our private lives, we are looking at videos that hundreds of thousands or millions of people get to see. And you go on their YouTube channels of many of these companies, and a video could be out there for 4 months and have 60 views. And it's like, you spent thousands to create that.
So, yeah, that's right. That's right. And I think that's one big difference. We spend way too much money and time on a single piece of content when we don't really know exactly what's going to get people excited. And so you need more at bats, to do that. So you have to have a way to produce content at less cost. But that brings us, I think, to the question of authenticity, because it's not just content for content's sake. It's really, what is that other kind of content that people are watching and spending time with and drawing attention? It's real people telling their stories. And those people who tell those stories have credibility because they're their stories, right? And so what we think is the equivalent for business is a community level effort as opposed to an individual personal brand effort. So what I mean by that is that one creator who's really charismatic, can make videos and tell stories and have excitement. But if you're a business, the CEO of that business is not that creator. They're unlikely to have that same personality. They're unlikely to have those same stories.
There's only so many Gary V's, right?
Yeah, I think it's an outlier in a way. But the other piece is that you have less credibility talking about your own business than your customers do talking about your business, right? Like, I have an agenda with my business. I want to tell people it's amazing. And that's what people expect from you as an owner of a business. And that agenda is really clear, right? But if you are getting your customers to talk about your business, if you're getting your employees to talk about your business, if you're getting your partners to talk about your business, then you have this community of people that bring credibility to it, that bring authenticity to it, that you can't bring. And so the challenge is that those people, the customers, the employees, the partners, don't necessarily want to be creators, and they certainly don't want to be creators on your behalf all the time. So you have to have a way to lift up the voices of, let's call it the casual creator, the person who's willing to tell a story, but they don't want to be on camera all the time. They don't want to learn how to use video software. They don't want to learn the algorithm of these social tools, right? They just want to tell a story. They're happy to do it. If it's something that's authentic to them and moving to them and important to them, just for the same reason people will put a review on Yelp or on Google, they're willing to say, worked with Ken and I had this amazing experience and it was great for my business. They're happy to give that back to you if you give them the opportunity to do so. So you need tools that make it really easy not to make videos yourself, but to lift up the voices of others in your network, and then be able to bring that content together to use on behalf of the business. And that's what we built at Gather Voices. We're called Gather Voices because we're really all about the voices of the people in your community and lifting them up to create a really powerful peer influence and social proof around a company to have impact on the goals that you have, whether that's recruitment or retention or sales or whatever it is. Lifting up the voices of those people is going to have power that you just can't get out of a marketing department.
So, I was going to draw a parallel to review sites like Capterra or G2 or Trust Radius. And in fact, almost seems like could be a great partner opportunity or way for your customers, to use the content they create with you, to include it in these review environments where when people are shopping for a B2B solution, they're seeking the voice of other customers, right? That's what they're looking for. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think in the next couple of years, we're going to start seeing a lot more video in those kinds of review sites. Today, they're all kind of obsessed a little bit with certain quality of production and things like that. And, companies will send like camera crews, like this is how valuable those reviews are, that they'll send a camera crew. Or I just had a case where one of our people was willing to do a review of one of our companies that we work with, vendors, and they sent him a kit, like a DSLR camera and instructions and setup. And then he had a Zoom call with the producer and he had to kind of run his own video shoot at home, which was a really heavy lift for somebody willing to do a review, but he was willing to do it. But that's not really scalable, right? And so, what we've tried to do is say, oh, well, instead of chasing people for that content when you need it, you should be talking to these stakeholders, your customers, your employees, your fans, your members, your donors. You should be talking to them all the time, asking them for content all the time, because then you have this library of content that you can use and reuse and mix and match and repurpose and create montages and, do different things with, as opposed to thinking of every video as a project that has a beginning and an end that takes all this time and all this money and all this effort. And then you get disappointed in how few people actually use it. If I have a mechanism to ask every customer right after the sale, why did you buy this? Or on a product, have a QR code that leads to a video capture to say, tell us what you love about this. Then you start to collect content all the time and you're shocked at what people can say that you could never have made up, incredible stories of how people connect to your products that also give you insights into the language people use, into the emotions that your product or your service is eliciting in people that you can use in your other marketing, right? So there's real power in that. And I think that's the new paradigm, is thinking about, how are we adding video to our communications? How are we listening with video all the time as opposed to, one-offs?
I wanted to just amplify this point about listening, because product management is often the unsung hero in these client companies, and they stop listening. Like they do a lot of listening when they're creating their first go at the product. Maybe the first couple of years, there's a lot of focus on the customer. And then as they scale up, that founder-led product marketing, product management function kind of gets pushed off onto pros. And if they're not able to listen in an effective way, they can kind of lose the thread of why the idea was so powerful in the first place. So it might be a great application for this kind of technology across not just the revenue generation or revenue retention, but also this idea of, hey, I want to be able to continuously listen to my customers. Here's one way maybe we can do it, solicit that kind of feedback that's not for publication.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that there's so much for research like that, but also even internal communications. Today we have these standard operating procedures and all these documents and stuff on the intranet that nobody wants to read either. And so having even the idea of knowledge management and knowledge capture using short videos as well is something we just don't see yet inside businesses, where I think we will start to see that as the tools like AI are able to read what's in a video, what is somebody saying, what's the context of it, what's their emotions. It'll be much easier to take large amounts of video content and categorize it, make it searchable, make it available in a way that you needed documents to do. So I think we're going to start seeing a lot more where, companies are going to share knowledge and capture things and, have a lot of different kinds of communication using video, because it'll just be easier to process that content in a way that just wasn't possible until now.
Interesting. Yeah. We had a longtime client that was in the TV search business, and they indexed the spoken word, but that was an expensive paid for application, sort of a closed garden of database. But I could easily see the idea of, we get our subject matter experts to tell you how to do a business process. And instead of, as you said, this long form document I have to read, just here, Mary, the expert, show us how to process invoice, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And now the tools are so good that you can be taken to points in a video and not just, the whole video. You see YouTube already does that. If you do search on how to things and it pulls up a video, it'll actually like section that video for you and say, here's the section that seems relevant to what you're searching on. So, I think we're going to see those kinds of tools just be much more normal, inside companies. But, back to the part about customers and about the sort of revenue generating side, you have to train your customers to share with you, if they're not used to it. And, we've spent so many years just pushing communications at people, pushing stuff into their inboxes, all this kind of one-way communication. I think it's a much more modern way to think about it, to think, hey, we're actually in dialogue with our customers about what we sell, about our product, about, what we do. And we want to have that feel right from the get-go. So how do we, make our customers know that they're valued? And, that's important for employees as well. So bigger companies, having really challenges recruiting, and those are things that you can create and set the tone and the culture and the values of an organization that somebody wants to affiliate with. I think, we have a lot of products that are commoditized today. And the reason somebody chooses one thing over another is often just how that one makes them feel. And, a lot of that, I think you can have real impact on if you focus on that listening.
Interesting. Hey, I want to turn our attention to how you funded the business, your perspective on when, how, and why to take investment dollars. So let's talk about how you've grown Gather Voices and decisions you've made in that regard.
Sure. First of all, I think we got very lucky that, I had the idea for Gather Voices while running an agency with a significant sized software development team, because that meant that I could incubate the idea using the cash flow from the business where the idea originated, and in the end of the day, that business got a percentage of the equity in the new business because, it's investment that got it, to the beginning. So that felt very lucky, meaning I didn't have to raise any outside capital initially to have an MVP, to validate the product, to get out in the market. We were able to do that, in the context of an existing operation. And then, we did have some really tremendous investors. We took a seed round of investment, and we did that primarily for speed. We're in a space where technology is moving much faster than it did. And we thought the window for this is not going to last forever. We really have to move quickly to do that. And that's harder, much harder without outside capital, particularly for SaaS companies that often have to get in front of their revenue, in terms of sales, and then the revenue's kind of trickling in over time. So having some way to capitalize the company can be really helpful. But we also limited that. And so we did some angel round and a seed round, but a really reasonable valuation. And when everything was super frothy in the last few years, we decided not to raise and to continue to grow and essentially go back to more of a bootstrap mode. And I'm really happy that we did that, because I see so many companies today that might have some cash on the balance sheet because they raised, but they have a valuation that's just completely not sustainable in the new world that we're in. And so, they've limited their exit options. And if they need to raise more, they're going to have to do a down round. And so what looked like a big victory for them, 2 years ago, kind of puts them in a box in a bind today. And so I'm happy that we're not in that. Obviously the bootstrap mode is much harder. You have to be super conscious of your costs. You've got to be super conscious of investments and the time it takes for investments to pay off. So you can't necessarily be thinking as long term. You've got to think about sort of what will drive revenue today and tomorrow and not next year, which doesn't always lead to the best decisions. So, I can see the benefits of, and I've been in businesses that have been completely bootstrapped, and I've been in businesses that are really fully venture backed and go through the whole cycle. And there's pros and cons to those different things. And I think the key is that the opportunity, that the company has to be a good fit for the financing approach that you take, right? So the worst case I've seen is when somebody does take, venture funding and their business ends up not being a venture scale business. And they could have made a very profitable business, but because they took venture funding, they were pressed to grow in a way that was not sustainable or not organic to what they were trying to do, and then it ends up imploding later on. So I think there's lots of ways to do it. And it can feel like it's just easier to get money. And, it's certainly easier to have money in the bank and to be able to pay people and hire people and all those things. But it doesn't necessarily mean that your outcome's going to be better. And so I think a lot of people raise money to deal with short-term pain and, aren't necessarily doing what's in the best long-term interest of their business.
Is there any way you approach the idea of am I or am I not, venture scalable? I mean, is there a way to know that? I mean, there's a lot of ego gratification too, right? If some name brand VC pops $20 million in the bank, that carries a lot with it. But if you're going to be honest with you, how do you know that?
Yeah, I think it's not always easy to tell. And, there's plenty of stories about the outliers who started something that looked small and turned out to be huge. And so, I don't think there's a surefire way to know. The way that investors think about it often is they think about the TAM, the total addressable market, where they go, okay, who can buy this and how big is that? And what does that look like? But it's, again, not an exact science. And sometimes you're creating the TAM. You look at a company like Airbnb or Uber, like there wasn't a TAM for Uber when Uber started. The addressable market was people who take taxi cabs. Uber's much bigger than that now, because people who never took a taxi cab are taking Ubers. And so that, they grew a market. And so that, some of the big opportunities look like that. So it's really not an exact science, but you're right. It's hard. When other people get excited about it, it's hard to take a step back from that and say, is this really what I want?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting you brought up the Uber thing. We talked before about, I'm going to give up a car in our household. And, the cost of that car, let's call it $1,000 a month between insurance. Here in Connecticut, we have property tax and a lease payment. And one of the alternatives, which didn't exist, and we discussed here because we live in a small city, is I can Uber. If my wife and I need to be in two different places, that's a solution that didn't exist. There was no TAM for that.
Yeah, 100%. That's right. And you could take a lot of Ubers for the cost of a car payment, right? So it's really interesting. And I think we see that playing out with younger generations who don't think of car ownership the way we did when we were young. When I was 16, I ran to get my driver's license. It was freedom. and two of my kids don't drive, and have no interest in it. So it's really a different world that we're in. But, I think it's a really interesting question about what makes something venture scale and what doesn't. And, I think generally the way that venture funds work, the venture math is really, really hard.
It's grisly.
It's really nuts. It's like, if they're going to invest in you from their fund, they want to believe that your one company could return the whole fund. So that's generally, rule of thumb kind of thing. So generally, you've got to be $1 billion company at least for, that math to work. And $1 billion company in value means you're getting at least $100 million in revenue, let's say. Again, these are all just kind of rules of thumb, but so what's the path to $100 million in revenue? That's a lot of revenue, so I think you have to be thinking really big, really world changing, really, tremendous. And, a lot of people who end up having successful companies don't necessarily have the most successful outcomes, meaning they've diluted themselves so much to get the cash to grow to that scale over time that they own, a fraction of the company, especially if you have a group of co-founders and other things where you're only, starting with a small percentage of the company. And then, those people who might have sold their company, bootstrapped their company and sold it for a few $1 million might go home with more cash in the bank than the person, who had that big ego filling outcome. So I think that's another thing just to remember is that, the ownership levels of those companies just goes down and down and down as they keep raising, versus you could be a lot smaller and have an outcome that would be more personally beneficial.
So is the proposition for a founder better with the angel and kind of seed money, assuming that's enough to get you there and you can bootstrap from there?
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction, right? It doesn't mean you don't have to take any money. But in the early days, when you're doing things like convertible note rounds or safe rounds, where really people aren't getting preferred stock, they don't have, special rights and things, you can take that money and still have optionality later. As long as your valuation isn't crazy in doing those things, you have optionality where you don't have to take that bigger venture deal later on, and you can move into that more bootstrap mode. It's when you start to get that, that B round, where you're on a path you can't get off of. Once somebody invests that $20 million, you're married to them forever now, and the valuation is set. And so all those potential outcomes you could have had before are off the table. Those people aren't going to allow it. They don't want it, and they would rather have you try to shoot for the moon and die than to have that sale, that's below where they're going to really make money. And so I've seen that more than once, companies that had really good businesses being pushed beyond, what the capacity of those businesses really were, and ending up with bad outcomes for everyone. But that's how VCs think about their portfolios, and the portfolio approach is, a set of my companies are going to die, and that's okay. And a few of them are going to be massive hits, and that's what's going to return our fund. They call it power law. And it's like, I don't want to be on the wrong side of somebody's power law thing, right? Because for us founders, like, this is our baby. And, for the VC, hey, you're one of a bunch of babies. And if a bunch of them disappear, that's okay. And so I think you have to make sure you align your values, you align your goals and your outcomes. And, to go for the big win, you've got to believe in it really, really deeply.
I think there's an interesting point here. I think commonly people think of bootstrapping as from the very beginning, never taking money. And maybe it's better to say, hey, we're priming the pump and now we're self-sustaining. It's almost not really the way people use the word bootstrap, but, to be able to organically grow once you've got a business that.
Yeah. And I think that's totally fair. It takes a lot to build a product. It takes time, and you don't make any money while you're building. And most people can't afford to do that. They can't afford the cost of that without some support. And so having angel investors and others who would believe in an idea and let you get to that first phase, that first level where you can validate it and start working it as a real company, that's really valuable. I don't think it takes anything away from the idea of bootstrapping. I mean, there's definitely a certain privilege in that, right? Like if I'm a trust fund baby, I can bootstrap my business, but what does that really mean? Perhaps,
investor, right? It's just a different
yeah, that's exactly right. It's just a different investor. But again, you have to align your investor with what they hope the outcomes would be. And there's a lot of angel investors who want to be in the early stages of those venture scale businesses. But there's other angel investors who want to be in a good business. And if the valuation's reasonable and you won't need additional money after them, they love that because you would have an exit probably much quicker than you would in those venture scale businesses. I saw something recently. I don't have the exact data in front of me, but it's over a decade. The average amount of time from founding to IPO, for example, is well over a decade.
Oh, yeah. So, hey, I've been doing the agency business for about 35 years. And of all the overnight successes I ever publicized, I can't remember one that was much younger than 6 years old. The average was probably 8 or 9 by the time they were ready for us to do our thing to really propel them forward. It takes a long time.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, I want to just visit with one subject that we didn't cover yet. So it's kind of stepping back from the investment arena. And I think this applies to you and so many businesses that we get involved with at this younger stage, which is the idea of the audience, the customer base being solution aware or problem aware. And, maybe this talks to demand generation as opposed to old school lead gen. And I just wonder what your perspective is about that and, how solutions like yours help with this creating, awareness both of the problem and the solution, because that's certainly where we're trying to drive our clients.
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand where your customers are coming from and what they know and what you have to teach them. And there's certain categories that are mature and people are searching for those things. So, a good example of that in the SaaS world might be a CRM system or an email platform, right? People know that they need one of those. They know there's a category of those things. There's names that they would recognize, Salesforce or Constant Contact or, MailChimp or something, right? Like there's a maturity in that market. And so they might be solution aware. They know what their challenge is, they know what they need, and they know there's a bunch of solutions out there and they're searching for solutions. That's really nice on the one hand, because you can start talking about why our solution's better. And you can just start from here's what we offer from a solution perspective. In what we're doing, it's totally different. Gather Voices is a pretty new idea. The idea of a platform for user-generated content at scale for businesses. And it's really solving a problem that's not necessarily a problem about video. So yes, do we have customers who are finding us because they are trying to collect video from people and they can't do it and they need some tools and we're a good tool? Those are amazing customers because they get it in 1 second. They know exactly what they want and they wish that they had us before. They are like, oh my God, I've been banging my head against the wall trying to figure this out and you guys solve it. But that's a fraction of our customers because most people aren't necessarily thinking about that. They're thinking about the things that we solve. They're thinking about sort of the jobs to be done is another way to say it, which is for our clients might be, how do I gain membership? Or we do a lot in the event industry. So Gather Voices is used to increase registrations for trade shows and other kinds of events. And so, somebody would be problem aware. I need more people to come to my events. Our post-COVID event numbers are lower than they were pre-COVID. People are hesitant to travel and spend the money. I want people to understand that they should come to the event. What we find is that video content, real people telling their stories, real attendees talking about why they're attending is the best possible way to convince other people to come. And so they're aware of their problem. They're not necessarily aware of our solution to their problem because there's 10 different ways to solve that, right? You can do more ads. You can do lots of things to drive registration for an event. We're a specific and different approach to a solution. So that requires us to really understand that and then educate the buyer around that and to focus our marketing on the problem and how we solve it, as opposed to just saying, look at our features and functions, because it's irrelevant, right? If somebody's not looking at if video isn't the thing they think they're searching for, we say, we got this great video software. They're like, well, what does that have to do with me? And so I think that's really important. And I think it really differs depending on what kind of company you are and who your target market is. But, to me, that is a clear strategy thing that has to be figured out, is not only who's our ideal customer profile, who are the personas that we're going after, but what do they know? Are they problem aware or solution aware? I think that's a really important conversation to have before you spend dollars and time and effort in your demand generation or marketing.
That's great. Thank you for framing that just perfectly. So last question on my list, knowing what you know now, Michael Hoffman, what would you do differently?
Oh boy, probably so many things, right? I think the thing that I would do differently with Gather Voices is our tool can be used for a lot of different things. And the natural human inclination is to preserve optionality around those things. Like if you want to use Gather Voices for knowledge management, great, it'll do that. If you want to use it for sales, great, it'll do that, right? And you can hedge these things. And we did too much of that early on. We said, hey, this can be used for a lot of things, until we found the idea of the things we really wanted to focus on. And so I think you can never have too much focus. I think that, narrow what you're doing, at least to the start, get traction in that, and then build out from there. I think we had talked about this before, this idea of drilling for oil. A very common problem of startups is they drill for oil, they get a little oil, they get excited, and they move their rig to somewhere else to drill for oil instead of just drilling deeper at the place where they hit oil. And so, for us, I think I would have drilled deeper earlier as opposed to taking longer to sort of find out what that thing was. So I think that would be the one thing that I would think about, how we do that differently.
Yeah, I've heard it said as there's riches in the niches. And that's probably good advice for young software companies to follow.
Yeah, I think so. I really think that the vertical specific companies, the use case specific workflows are much more powerful than generic tools. And there's a lot of generic tools out there, that do some things. But I think if you want to be able to charge real B2B pricing models and things like that, you've got to solve specific problems for specific customer types.
Well, let's leave it there. This was a great discussion. Michael, thanks so very much. I really enjoyed it. If people want to learn more about your company or reach out to you, how can they do that?
Sure. You can learn more about Gather Voices at gathervoices.co. And the best place to find me is probably on LinkedIn. So just Michael Hoffman at Gather Voices on LinkedIn. Very easy to find that way.
Awesome. Thank you. And if people want to reach me, I'm on LinkedIn/in/Ken Lempit. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast yet, please do so wherever podcasts are distributed. And thanks again, Michael. It was a great conversation. Can't wait to publish it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the SaaS Backwards Podcast, brought to you by Austin Lawrence Group. We're a growth marketing agency that helps SaaS firms reduce churn, accelerate sales, and generate demand. Learn more about us at www.austinlawrence.com. You can email Ken Lempit at kl@austinlawrence.com about any SaaS marketing or customer retention subject. We hope you'll subscribe, and thanks again for listening.